here and have him speak to an audience at the OAI. We're an optimistic bunch, and sometimes that optimism may get away from us. I just want you to know that Professor Coyne is a very widely published and cited researcher, not on the internet, mainly in the areas of health, psychology, and psychiatry, but as an extension of this actually quite serious life and death kind of work. Jim has brought his critical eye to kind of high-profile research in a number of domains, areas where there's a lot of promise, but there's also potentially a lot of hype and a lot of spin, kind of sometimes on the researcher level, sometimes on the press office level, and also with the press proper. Personally speaking, I found his perspectives and thinking quite refreshing when I think about my own work and trying to take a critical eye so that science can be robust. And I think that many of the critiques that Jim talks about actually apply very nicely to internet research. They might be about depression and cancer and or some kind of factor about mindfulness, but I think a lot of this stuff really feeds into our work here. So with that, I'd like to welcome Jim here to speak, and he will be talking, broadly speaking, I understood, about the promises and pitfalls of future internet research.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me, for the nice introduction. And first, some special thanks. Nick Brown, my graduate student, and the go-tos. When I allow my writing, it often gets more intelligent than I am because of the extensive network with which I interact constantly on the internet. And I'd estimate since 2009, at least certainly over 24 papers I've written, at least not having ever met at least one of the authors. And these people represent the regulars, but certainly it's not a limit. Skeptical Cap is just a floating pseudonym that people adopt sometimes when they want to feed me stuff, and I want to make sure that I want to give them credit, but they don't want to be acknowledged. So it's a floating title that people know who if they were at one point the Skeptical Cap, they know there are others. I'm not an internet researcher, as Andrew mentioned, but hopefully I have something to offer today. And I'm also, as you'll discover, quite a skeptic, but I'm also encourage you to be skeptic about what I present. And I would consider it a matter of respect if you could point out things that I say that are inaccurate or there are better data available. And American don't stand on ceremony, so if it's rubbish, call me on the rubbish, and I'll appreciate it. So next time I won't inflict it on the audiences. But basically, the questions I want to ask you is, to what extent do you consider the research in the internet studies to be untrustworthy? Anybody? Is there worries about that? Do you, to what extent do you see internet studies to be vulnerable to embarrassing false positive discoveries that sweep through the social media and the vanity journals? Does that happen? Do you notice it sometimes? I'll pick out some examples. They may not be representative examples. And to what extent do you feel the need to protect the credibility of internet studies from false and exaggerated claims? One sort of responsibility I'll suggest to you by the end of my talk, and you can reject it, is that I believe that it's a fairly unusual, if not unique, situation being as an Institute for Internet Studies. And it comes with a potential responsibility, and it could become a useful resource to both raising the standards of the field, but also being a watchdog on that. And I'll also suggest that there's to the extent to which the field is racked by false discoveries, the Institute could suffer. Some relevant things about me: I'm concerned about the trustworthiness of the scientific literature and its representations in literature. Greater involvement in social media. Now you hear my pitch, implicit and later explicit in my talk. And also I'm an advocate for post-publication peer review and for taking responsibilities for judging the credibility of science away from editors and a few cronies, and distribute it in the larger community of citizen scientists, and that peer review is an ongoing live dynamic process for the life of an article. Some assumptions I make: that there's a strong alignment of institutional agenda and individual incentives that fosters an emphasis on novelty and newsworthy. There's not robustness and accuracy. And the same alignment serves to mitigate against criticism and whatever self-corrective powers that scientific publications are presumed to assume. And this occurs also and is amplified in the media representations of science. I think that my first contact with Andrew was in social media. It's sort of strange. I'm over here on a Carnegie visiting professorship until August, and I have my charge of going out in public engagement, but only north of the border, because Carnegie is very much, let's keep it to the Scots, but on my own I'm allowed to come down to England. But I'm discovering a really complex, I guess what Merton called an invisible college out there, of people, like-minded people who are connected to each other. And like recently I spoke at Bristol, and I discovered that the reason why I was there was someone had invited me who was connected to someone who invited me to Australian National University, and ultimately I got an appointment there. But neither of them had I met except for through the internet. And then I also met George Davy Smith there, and I found out that he was connected, not surprisingly, to some other people I very much admired. So I'm going around and finding a lot of like-minded people, and it's been a great time. But as you can see from some of these titles from my blogs, I take aim at the media, I take aim at the editorial process, and I take aim at individual authors in terms of deficiencies in the quality, accuracy, and reproducibility of what they do. As Andrew mentioned, I sort of cut my teeth in the area of health psychology when I got appointed as Director of Behavioral Oncology at the Abenson Cancer Center of the University of Pennsylvania. I ran into a literature that I was very skeptical about, that insisted that support groups could extend the lives of cancer patients. And I didn't believe the evidence was consistent with that. And in fact, I felt it was a potentially burdensome obligation to put on cancer patients, that if they didn't extend their lives through use of psychology, then they were somehow responsible. And I didn't feel that was fair at all. And when I started expressing criticism of that, I got a pretty vicious backlash that I'll talk about tomorrow. And but it drew me into thinking more critically, not only about what happens in the literature, but the institutional structures that put it there and keep certain things out, that shape it beyond the even the wishes of the individual authors, but also the compliance of individual authors with these institutional structures. I'll say more about that as we go. As emerging technology intruding into our lives, the internet can kind of a blank screen into which we project our fears and aspirations. And one of the risks with internet studies is that it can support some good stories. I'm part Italian, and in the village dialect where my grandmother came from, there was a saying that roughly translates, "If it isn't true, it ought to be." And it's sometimes compelling narratives arise and persist because they're good stories. And internet studies, because of the mystery and supposed power of the internet, gives rise to all kinds of narratives which are interesting but not necessarily true. And we've seen it in concerns about fears, about violent video games, about internet addiction. And I think sometimes that studies that would not be accepted in other cognate areas get a lot of attention in internet studies, precisely because the internet and big data are involved. And one of the messages that I'm going to give in my talk today is the need to engage cognate disciplines. As I understand it, internet studies is substantively defined. It's by area of interest. and often methodologies are borrowed and are more familiar to other disciplines. And there can be opportunistic intrusions into the internet studies by people who aren't playing the rules by the disciplines in which they're more familiar. Again, I'll talk more about that. So the idea is that it's a novel developing technology with a sense of magic and untapped potential, and so that people approach internet studies with certain biases and certain expectations, untested assumptions, and even suspension of belief. And there are a lot of sort of man bites dog stories in the internet studies literature where ideas get promoted because of their sheer implausibility, given what's known in other disciplines. And I encourage skepticism when we encounter man bites dog stories. In general, any claims of breakthrough. Normal science doesn't produce a lot of breakthrough discoveries, and there are a lot of false positive discoveries, and the scientific publication process and the funding process is oriented to encouraging false discoveries. And so the often things that can take hold in internet studies, they'd be recognized as even silly and certainly at odds with other disciplines and the methodologies. So what I encourage people to do is develop a set of robust prior probabilities when they encounter a new claim. Does this make sense in terms of what we know? And often claims of, cure for cancer found, see the news tonight in the media, and that happens a lot. And these cures come and go without any real effect on certainly on patient care and cancer outcomes. The decline effect, it's the notion, it's pretty robust, and it occurs a lot across a lot of fields. It's the idea that initial claims for a particular hypothesis will be contradicted by the results of later, better designed and transparently reported studies. And hot topics of research are especially vulnerable to this. In my own work, I aim a lot of my blog posts against the tooth fairy science of psychoneuroimmunology. And the idea is that people are investigating how psychological factors affect the incidence and cause progress and mortality of cancer, when in fact we've never established that psychological factors have those sorts of influence. But they become extremely aggressive about defending research they see as supporting those claims. So you attack a study, or you even offer even a mild critique, and you get attacked from all sides because you're basically going after some wisdom that's required to fund and support the credibility of other investigations that you hadn't even thought about the connection. But the idea about the decline effect is that there's sometimes prematurely exaggerated claims have damaged developing areas of research. I think we saw that in the internet psychotherapy, where there are unrealistic expectations that there needed to be no people involved. And a GP could give out a prescription for internet psychotherapy, and the person would find benefit. And I think later internet psychotherapy was salvaged by an appreciation there had to be people involved, and very useful concepts developed like supportive accountability. Basically, when a patient goes out and receives therapy on the internet, they have to somehow feel that in some way they're interacting with people, and the people count on them to do what they're supposed to do, and will hold them responsible if they don't. And having done treatment of in diverse areas like increasing adherence with problem-solving therapy for HIV patients with hard biomedical outcomes, I appreciate that often it's not so much the technology or the techniques, but it's a sense of relationship and responsibility. And I think similarly we're finding out with apps now, with health apps, after a lot of overblown enthusiasm for them, that they work in a rather narrow range, and that people have to be committed to the goals that they're pursuing. And you can't look to apps to impose goals that the patients or the people using them don't always already embrace. And I think both areas suffered, and people are putting in grant applications, for instance, had rough time for a while until some of these issues got clarified, and the field escaped from out under the cloud of false discoveries. Bad science is protected by the Pink Floyd rule. The Pink Floyd rule, I was shocked. One of the outgoing editors of one of the prominent and prestigious psychological journals, Psychological Science, he coined the term Pink Floyd rule because he was proud of not accepting research that was only another brick in the wall. It had to be innovative, and it had to be breakthrough, or it wasn't acceptable for publication. And that set up some perverse incentives in that area of psychology, where people went for the innovative and the newsworthy and the breakthroughs, and robustness and reproducibility of findings really suffered. I like the term that John Unethical, is one of my intellectual heroes, developed when he talks about obligated and obliged publication. Obligated publication is when the dominant view and the institutions require that people adopt a certain conclusion to get a paper published. And the obligated comes from the institution. Obliged is the behavior of authors who spin their results to fit the expected dominant view. And John Unethical coined these terms when he was reacting to a study that I did, where there'd been 7 studies in a row, all of them showing that a particular personality variable predicted death among patients with chronic heart failure. And I came in with a study that was the first negative finding published, and he predicted that there'd be an unleashing of negative findings pulled out of the desk drawers, or people would stop spinning the results, and that's exactly what happened after that study. And it marked the decline of type D personality research. The other aspect, the acceptability of normative p-hacking. I'll say a little bit more about p-hacking in a bit, but it's basically crafting your results to ensure that they're positive. And I'll show some of the tricks that people do to do that. And also the restrictions on post-publication, peer review, and self-correction. Science is supposed to be self-correcting, but if so, it's very inefficient in accomplishing that, and it's often because the dominant views restrict criticism of them and suppress. John Unethical talked about something related to the decline effect, the Proteus phenomena, which things would emerge very dramatically in the medical literature, and then they would be cut down to size and often disappear. And a surprising number of high-profile clinical trials can't be reproduced in subsequent studies. And he suggests that that's because of the flexibility with which people report their designs and do their analyses. Some colleagues at Penn, where I'm an emeritus professor, they did an interesting study. They had Penn graduate students listen either When I'm 64 by the Beatles or Kalimba, and then they, in a presumably unrelated task, they indicated their birth date and their father's age. And then they reported this paper very straight-faced, that they found that people who had listened to When I'm 64, and they'd been randomized that condition, actually turned out to be older as a result than those who listened to Kalimba. And what they did in that article is they specified, they wouldn't tell you how they arrived at that result, but they suggested some of the things that could have been used, and that other findings in the literature might have used similar techniques. And others have articulated 6 ways to p-hack. Stop collecting data once you've got a significant result. If it's not significant, keep going. Analyze with many measures, but report only those that meet the magical p less than 0.05. Collect and analyze many conditions, but only report those with p less than 0.05, use covariates and don't report the results for unadjusted variables. Exclude participants, say they're outliers, to get p less than 0.05, and then transform the data rather than using the existing distribution. It's interesting that the authors I just mentioned, they confronted a prominent social psychologist in the United States and said that he got significant results, more than you would expect, substantially more often than you would expect from the size of his studies. And he was either dropping conditions, picking alternative measures, or just dropping whole studies. So in a series of 6 studies, they would work out more than would be statistically probable. And he readily conceded that. And he said, yes, that's what I do. Everybody does that. So they developed an algorithm based on that particular psychologist. And this is public knowledge, I'm not like gossiping. But then when they applied it to other prominent social psychologists, the behavior looked exactly the same. So something's going on endemically in the literature. So I'm going to look at 3 examples of widely hailed but untrustworthy internet research. And you probably are more familiar with these studies, and you can call me on it. And if you think a particular point is rubbish, again, just don't stand on ceremony. Rubbish. Comfortable with that. I've been doing pub talks in Scotland and talking to people who are very intelligent but a little drunk. And it's been a great experience. You couldn't get people that way in the States that start throwing things or insulting you or whatever. They with a certain level of politeness.
We will be going to the White Rabbit.
So maybe I can get some English
after drinks.
behavior. Yeah. So one of the studies is alleged emotional contagion through social networks. Another one, 60 million person experiment in social mobilization, political mobilization. And the third that I'm going to pay particular attention to, the idea that, as it was titled in the popular press, that angry tweets cause heart disease mortality. And I didn't know too much about Andrew before I came here, except for how we interacted in the social media. But I did know that I'm either notorious or interesting, depending on your point of view, for the devastation that I inflict on certain studies. And so I'll do this as a test example of just reducing it to rubble in front of you. And I've been accused that I often see things that people don't see, but once I point them out, everybody can't help but see them, much to the dismay of some authors who write letters of complaint to my university. Okay, let's look at the massive scale emotional contagion. This was a study with 689,000 participants. Are people familiar with this study? Anybody that's not familiar? No, it might be out of the area, sure. So basically, what they did, and it's been widely distorted in the press, is they basically dampened people's emotional, verbal content in their feed that they were being fed of news in Facebook, and it affected their behavior. And what's massive about it? Well, there's a massive number of subjects. It's a phenomenal number of subjects, but the actual effect was actually quite small. But in the reporting of it, they emphasized not that it was so small, and I'll explain a little bit how small it was, but that it was statistically significant. And with just a basic background in statistics, it's very difficult if you've got flexible number of measures that you don't get something significant with that number of subjects. And so, as a critic pointed out later, the size was so small, 0.02 of a standard deviation. If you wanted to put that in other terms, it'd be comparable to a hypothetical treatment that increased the average height of the male population in the United States by 1/20th of an inch, when there's a standard deviation of 2 inches in male height. So it's basically really, really hard to find it. And it's theoretically interesting, but not particularly meaningful. And then others pointed out that they got people to change the verbal content of their post, but that doesn't mean they necessarily change their emotions. And it could be just some sort of in training procedure where people even not even thinking about it. They're just shifting with the stimuli that are being provided. And then critics also pointed out that the coding system for affect couldn't grasp negatives, so that I am not happy is equivalent to I am happy. And these very fragile results depend on that being seen as equivalent. And so again, it's really, really small and probably not interpretable. There are ethics issues raised about this. How dare these researchers manipulate people on Facebook? And I think it became a teachable moment for a lot of us to think about the ethics of experimentation. In fact, studies have to be reviewed by an ethics committee, but they can be exempted. And there was, I think, if I were on an ethics committee, I would have approved this study because there's nothing going on that wasn't happening already once people venture onto social media. Facebook is manipulating the feeds to them all the time and dictated by advertisers and everything else. And so this is a normative experience when you get out there. I recently went to a talk by some cryptographers and internet security people, and they talked about Edward Snowden, and they were very amused that he shocked everybody that the U.S. government was monitoring their social media and their phones, because that kind of thing's monitored all the time by businesses. And they felt that one of the good things that was accomplished is they just got people to confront that things aren't as private and secure as they think, and that maybe something needs to be done not only to deal with the U.S. government or the British government, but to advertisers and all these other influences. So the verdict on this study was exceeding weak results with flawed methodology and really not interpretable findings, but it sure got people agitated. And I think putting the term massive in the title was a big part of that. This is a massive study. I think the acceptance of the author's interpretation depends on dubious assumptions that minor changes in tweeting behavior actually represents changes in the emotional states of users. And again, we can talk about that. People are more familiar with the ethical issues or the field, but I was left rather skeptical. Okay, and so what's the takeaway message if we're going to cultivate skepticism? If we know that there's unknown but likely high prevalence of false positives out there, what do we learn from this? Beware of studies that emphasize p-values when they have large samples. They may be trying to hype the results. And the fact they chose that rather than emphasizing the effect size says a lot about the author's either naivete or their motivation. And again, that the idea of the massiveness of it might have fueled attention to not particularly interesting effects that are probably quite consistent with what's going on in the internet all the time. Okay, the 6 million person experiment in social mobilization. This was a study, again, in a very high impact journal. And the authors are known for sometimes extravagant claims. I could spend a whole hour on Fowler's claims about obesity being contagious and smoking being contagious. I can just give a counter example to his research. Using the same methodology, you can show that height's contagion and acne is particularly contagious, even if you don't have contact with people in your network. So there's something going on there, strange, and it's overstated. But in this particular study, they had 60 million people were in a particular group, and they were matched against. There was another randomization of 561,000 people, and then another to a control group of 56 100,000. And basically, some of the people got a simple message that they should vote. They got a link to find polling places. They had a clickable button indicated "I voted" that they could then display to their friends on Facebook. And there was another group that only got the message, but they weren't showing any faces of friends. So the key difference between this group and that is whether they get friends being shown to them. And there's a control group that didn't get any message at all.
So are those ends right, because they're an order of magnitude larger for the social message?
Yeah, it was intentional.
Oh,
Yeah,
right.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah. And there were some reasons for that. They basically standardized it. I'm not sure that it was temporarily, it was formally randomized. I
Mhm.
think they released the messages, and so it's a quasi-randomized study.
And the different ends, you only get to read those if you read the supplemental materials.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah. Well, that's the other thing. Now with requiring transparency, people have to report a lot more, but they often put it in supplementary material, and so you have to be motivated to go look at that. And Nick, he seems to be a pretty busy guy, my graduate student. He likes to read that sort of thing and comes up with some shocking disclosures. And when he looks at the tables in the supplementary data. As we'll talk about tomorrow, one of his recent capers was downloading some data from a very prestigious paper, and he reconstructed from the supplementary material 63 complex regression equations, replicate all of the results, but also could replicate the results with random numbers. And just as a teaser for tomorrow, the result was we wrote a critique of these authors. They downloaded their data, changed it, put it back up, and did another study which showed that we were idiots to arrive at those interpretations. Fortunately, Nick kept date-coded stuff, and so there's now is going to be quite a circus going on.
Wow.
So that's why I have a bit of an activist mentality and vigilante mentality, which you'll hear about tomorrow. Okay, so, but the users receiving social messages were only 2.8% more likely to click on the "I voted" than those receiving the informational message. And the users receiving the social message were only 0.2% likely. And again, there's a lot of emphasis on the significance levels, which it's tough not for things to be significant when you get that. Could be something about the non-randomization. And so they're actually, in terms of actual change in voting behavior, it was 0.39%. And these are kind of studies that I puzzle over, and what I do is I go find someone in the cognate disciplines. So what I did is I asked some political scientists, and they laughed at this study, and they said it wouldn't have been in a political science. How many people in the room are political scientists? What do you think about that study, the claims of strong effects?
Well, it's a weak effect, even the one they're demonstrating. And the idea that you can affect people's voting behaviour by telling them you voted is kind of boring. I mean,
Yes.
it's well known.
Yeah, so what's
The
boring...
fact that it also works on the internet is not terribly surprising.
Yeah, and that's what I'll also get to, what I found out from political scientists. But this would be a boring study in political science, but published in Science, it becomes an exciting study because it's the internet. And there's some mystery about the internet and the power of the internet. So there's something about it being an internet study. And yeah, I agree, the hypothesis is boring, the methodology is weak, and the conclusions are probably stretched. And if you actually look, there's been a lot of political science studies of using Twitter, and it's basically, be really cautious. It's easily gamed and often has weak behavioral effects. That'd be what you know from other studies. You probably know the other studies better than I do.
There are randomisation problems with using Twitter for anything anyway. So,
Absolutely, yeah.
I mean, as a political scientist, my main concern when people start waving Twitter around is to say, well, the population of people on Twitter is not the same as the population of people who vote. So,
Totally agree. And this was another, the Pew research basically, you know, they've been motivated by some of the findings claimed for social media to take a systematic look. and they came up pretty pessimistic about a way of influencing. And basically, there are a lot of political action groups that are wasting a lot of money in the United States on the belief that they're really changing behavior. Okay, here's the one I'm going to serve up, and you'll hopefully agree with me that has someone said in a grant review one time that I leave no vital signs. They said, "Can we please move on? I could put a mirror in front of that application that won't fog the mirror. Can we move on to the next application?" So we'll see what happens this, but we'll start off slow. And it's a study in the prior probabilities. It was in Psychological Science, and that's the journal where the editor coined proudly the phrase Pink Floyd studies are not acceptable. We don't want another brick in the wall. So this it's got a prior probability of being exaggerated claims. And in psychology, in a lot of fields, the higher the impact of a journal, the more prestige. It's more correlated with the retractions than the number of times your paper will get cited if it appears in that journal. And I can tell you, having tried to get some papers retracted from Psychological Science, it's a dogfight. So this study involved 140 million tweets that were mapped into 1,300 U.S. Counties. And because of the CDC, the Center for Disease Control Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System, they could look at other risk factors for arteriosclerotic heart disease. And so the notion was they were going to look at the emotional tone of the tweets and see if it could predict the rates of heart disease and, death from heart disease. And they would pit tweets against self-reported diabetes, obesity, smoking, and hypertension, common cardiovascular risk factors that would normally be taken into account. And so here you see the clusters of tweets. And with the hostility, aggression, I won't read those words. It's proper English gathering. You spend some time in a pub talk and you'd have to go over that and you say, what did that say? Of course, just to get you to say it. So these are the tweets that were supposedly correlated with county level mortality. And these are the tweets that were negatively correlated. And it's very highly significant. And here you see the size of the prediction from Twitter, but you see that when you put Twitter in with all the other predictors, there isn't that much of an improvement. You can see it there, but it's not huge, and we'll get into that. And so then there was some dazzling visuals, and these counties, they couldn't get the data from all the counties because some of them didn't have enough tweets. And so this is the one that's presented in the table, and it's hard to process that. It's supposed to be a shock and awe visual display because you can't really process it in any way. But the dodgy thing about it, it lists 10 colors and has Nick found using his Oxford acquired computing skills. He wrote a program to map these on the other, but it couldn't work for quite a while because he figured out there are actually 14 different colors. And so you're being misled from the start. Or maybe the fair interpretation is the authors didn't even understand what they were doing, which is not uncommon. And so when he mapped them, and his chart is different. When there is a green area, it means in that particular county, there's only a 2-point difference in the ranking of that county, and its ranking on mortality versus its tweets. So you can see that there's an awful lot of weak results that are only persuasive or impressive in their aggregate. And I'm going to demonstrate some skills. It takes a while to develop these, but once you start knowing where to look, I'm going to do a workshop in Newcastle in 2 weeks, and I'm going to have people give me papers, and I'm only allowed 10 minutes to critique them. not having ever seen them. But I'll probably really embarrass myself. But the idea is to just show what I go for. Has an editor and has a skeptic. And a lot's lying in plain sight, and that everybody misses it until you call their attention to it. The devil in the details. These are direct quotes. Why did they study counties? Well, they're the smallest social ecological level for which the CDC variables exist. So it was a compromising methodological decision, and I'll explain how compromising it is. But just to say, I've worked with people who do geocoding. That's where you try to relate environmental variables to things like obesity, and they find even postal codes are much too large. You have to have a few block areas for anything to work, and counties are inconceivable. And then they developed pre-used dictionaries for anger, anxiety, positive and negative emotions, and there was some inaccuracy in the dictionaries and how the tweets would actually be rated. So it was only 50-50 for some of the tweets categories. And then they created a single model with putting all the variables into one equation. I get nervous about that because you often find very strange phenomena arise when you have variables that are modestly correlated with each other and use them to predict another one. And okay, with all of this, why is that scary? Well, it's a huge sample, but p.049, people say either 0.05 or they don't. And there's, it's known in the psychology literature, there's an excess of statistical significance between 0.04 and 0.054. And so there's something goes on to force results into that range. Does that make sense? I don't know. Because you expect a smooth distribution. And if you map, the people who go to the trouble of mapping psychology journals find out that there's a bulge right around there. And so that's sort of, as I would say, a red flag on the playing field, but let's keep playing. We'll come back. And they relied on the mortality rates reported by the CDC, but we know that's the coding of reasons for death is typically done in the absence of autopsies, and it's pretty unreliable, and the unreliability varies by country, by county. And then finally, there were some problems with even the judgment. 140 characters does not provide a good basis for using any context to decide whether words represent what you'd like them to represent. But we're getting worse. Given the typical Twitter user is younger, 31, than the typical person at risk for heart disease, it's not obviously why their use of Twitter would predict the heart disease in the county. The people tweeting are not the people dying. So this is even an ecological study. It's a big mush. And then finally, and this is gets the really dodgy thing, one of the words in their dictionary was love, and they took it out because it didn't behave as expected. And they took it out only after looking at the results. So the flies in the ointment that are accumulating, the diagnoses are inaccurate. The rates of deaths from heart attacks vary from, if you look at some of the largest counties in the United States, the rates vary from 13.4 to 185. That's absurd biologically. It suggests that there's some sort of a bias in the reporting. And then finally, if you develop some biological model of atherosclerotic heart disease, then you have to take into account that it's a chronic developing condition that has its roots in childhood. And the childhood of the tweeters was before when they would have some of the accumulative of risk factors was before Twitter was around. But then again, the people were too young to have heart disease anyway. And furthermore, county residents in the United States, people are pretty mobile, with 5.4% moving every year, and you get a spell at which they're supposedly been exposing to risk factors, it's going to be, they're not even going to be correctly classified for county, but it gets worse. So what Nick did is he looked and he said, well, CDC has lots of information. I don't understand why they chose this one outcome. I think it's much more plausible that tweets will predict suicide. And so I'll look at the death by self-harm and then also by accident. And he found that he could construct wonderful equations using their same data, but unfortunately the results were better than their data, but in the wrong direction. So they find that use of negative language was significantly protecting against suicide. So people were counties where people are saying fuck and hate and things like that are somehow protected against suicide. Show me a biological model of that. This is a technique that I learned from George Davy Smith. And what he often does is he takes very plausible multivariate findings in epidemiology, and then the acceptance is because they seem so reasonable. And then he makes really unreasonable changes in the outcome variables or some of the control variables and finds out that he often can get the same results. And so his argument that emerges from his doings in epidemiology is just because studies are plausible doesn't make them right. And plausibility isn't necessarily a useful criteria in a multivariate environment. So the verdict: the results become nonsensical when relevant biology, epidemiology introduced, and when another just as plausible outcome is examined. And is evidence of p-hacking and adjustment of hypotheses and the independent variable after results are known. That's called harking, hypothesizing after results are known. That's why authors cringe when I announce I'm going to be blogging about the paper. So when I went to George Kaplan, a very prominent American emeritus epidemiologist, and he just laughed at this, and he sent me back a copy. Just was full of little yellow paste-ins that you can do with PDFs now. Like ridiculous, absurd, unwarranted assumption, doesn't make sense. And so the relevant cognate disciplines are epidemiology, biology in terms of what do you expect about the processes leading to death by a heart attack, statistics, the dodgy use of multivariate statistics, and moving covariates in and out. And at key points in the article, they report only the adjusted analyses, and they don't let you peek at the unadjusted analyses, suggesting there's some sleight of hand going on. And then finally, you could ask geocoders, and they would laugh at the idea that you'd expect to find anything reasonable. They would tell you this is even not an ecological study. And it's not that these studies are impossible. Here's a study that I thought was pretty good, and Bonnie Carroll, one of the people I have on my list of go-tos, got involved in this study. And they developed models trying to predict suicide at times of celebrity suicides. So what is the likelihood that a celebrity suicide got translated into other people committing suicide? And this study developed a model for predictors over 3 years. They validated in a second sample drawn from the same from a later period, and it worked very well. So there was a lot of care. It's biologically plausible, and it's validated in a second test with separate data. And so it's not that you're going to have to be monitoring Twitter to find out if people are going to kill themselves after a rock star kills themselves, but it is a plausible, even if not public health useful result. Okay, why do I rely so much on non-peer review sources for my critiques? I do that deliberately because it's so difficult and untimely to wait to critiques show up in the peer-reviewed literature. And there's been some great papers written about efforts of people who, mathematicians, statisticians, and sociologists who attempted to critique the work on contagion of obesity. They just could not get the papers published. And the original journals that published the original articles will not accept critiques. And so I believe that, and I keep pushing this, blogging is the new link between the literature and the consuming audience, and not just the lay audience, but the scientific audience. I think few people would be willing to read the heart attack paper with the care that Nick and I did. And I think there's a real role, and I'm going to suggest this in a bit for the Institute, to socially filter what's out there and interpret it, and to put your credibility at stake in terms of whether you're persuasive. But I wanted also, because my chairman says I got to go out and be positive, so I wanted to find a literature that was in ruins because of false positives that saved itself. And some of you may be familiar with this. It's a literature concerning whether a particular candidate, polymorphisms in a particular gene was related to vulnerability to depression. It's a very elegant model, and the suggestion is that it fits so much with thinking in so many fields. If it isn't true, it should have been. The idea was that if you have a particular a variant of a gene and you have adverse childhood experiences, you're set for life to be more likely to be prone to depression. Sociologists like George Brown would like that. He even changed his theory temporarily. The Freudians would love that, because basically your risk for depression is shaped by this particular single candidate gene. And careers were made and prizes were won. These are not grants, these are cash in the pocket prizes. And then it fell apart. And there were, when more data was available and meta-analyses were done, and I think Jonathan Flint's probably here at Oxford.
He is.
Yeah, he helped, when he skeptically looked at this literature, sort of dissolved in front of him, and he convinced other people too. And basically he found you could find no evidence. Well, how did they get these results? It was something about the data. It was chance findings, and probably unlikely chance findings. And again, it was done. So the meta-analysis, the conclusion was there was no evidence of the serotonin transported genotype alone or in action with stressful life events is associated risk. They looked at men, women, and both sexes combined. Nothing, nada. And it was followed up by other people taking a skeptical look. And I think they started out believing, Kathy did, I know her, and certainly Maria Kovacs is a psychiatrist that would be very attracted to that idea of such a mechanism. Nada, nothing they could find. And then Manufo sort of, cast doubt about the whole enterprise. So what happened? And then, another. They just started accumulating. Where were these findings before? I think some of them were in desk drawers. But also there was some technological breakthrough where we could cheaply map the genome and share it with other people and integrate data. So there was technological breakthrough that allowed people to replicate past research and to go for larger samples. Collaborations developed, and they kept finding nothing. And as a result, people moved to the idea that it was unlikely that single genes characterized any complex traits, whether it be height or schizophrenia or intelligence. It was a matter of small contribution of a large number of genes and of varying combinations. And people developed statistical techniques, the Manhattan plot, where it looks like, they call it Manhattan plot because it looks like a skyline, and you look at all of the genes in the array, and you calculate the level at which they have to rise above, given you're looking at so many, to any of them be significant. And as a result of these findings, they reformed publishing criteria, so that you had to do a replication, or you had to do combined data sets, and you had to make your data available for others to do the same if you wanted to make any more claims. And I think that was a success. Okay, the takeaway message to the Institute. I think that you should see the Institute as being a unique resource. You have a credibility that others look to you to having, and that can be a platform to establish standards, but it also could be a vulnerability if there's a lot of junk floating around in the internet literature. The sleuthing of claims requires time, attention to details, methodological and substantive knowledge. I think you saw from my handling of the heart attack paper that it's not to be casually undertaken unless you've got time and resources and have smart people backing you up. That's my go-tos. That's by Nick. And Nick did a lot of that work. And so we're confronted with claims that we're not in a position to immediately evaluate ourselves. And we're bombarded with such things. I work for Close One, a journal. We published 25,000 papers last year. That's a lot of papers. That's only 6% of the PubMed. There's a lot of stuff coming out. And I'm going to digress for a couple illustrative stories. And the message is, if you don't define your social media identity as an institute, someone will do it for you. Journalists in the media don't work for you. You need to relate to them, you need to collaborate with them, but they have their own agenda. And everything's countable these days, and they want views. The Guardian basically laid off all of their science writers and now depends on bloggers, and they keep track of how many hits blogs get. And that's valuable data. Even if it's meaningless, it's valuable to the bloggers. And so having a story to tell, it becomes more important, and they're competing with other people's that are making demands on the readership's attention. So here's a study done by a friend of mine. We were out, I went drinking with Hank, after this came out, and basically he got a grant from industry, $100, 100 euros, and he bought chewing gum, and he got 5 Dutch guys to chew the gum and spit it in buckets of water. And he's kind of a quirky guy. He doesn't make eye contact. He just likes being in his lab. He certainly isn't on Twitter. And so he was proud that they were able to publish a paper in PLOS One that basically what they did is they measured the bacterial content in the previously sterile water in terms of what had been spit. His colleagues later pointed out to him he could have avoided suspicious dealings with industry. He only got 100 euros for gum. If he had only had them spit in the buckets without chewing gum. But the curious thing that he didn't notice, the paper had just come out, and immediately it got 3,000 hits the next day and 4,800. And he went to bed confused about that, figuring he didn't understand these alt metrics anyway. And so then he found out what had happened is people had read the paper, and they started interpreting it differently. I think it started somewhere in India, where they announced that 100 million bacteria were trapped in that bucket of water, and it was better than flossing. And that chewing gum was now an alternative to flossing, at which point people started attacking him for just being a tool of the industry because he had accepted money from industry to do the study. And he was very upset about this. So the university called him and said, I think this is probably the article that started it out. No, I guess the Telegraph was the culprit. And so the university said, you've got to get out there. You're upset with us. We didn't do this. You should have had an article. Let's do a press release. He refused, and so they went and they photographed attractive co-eds around campus, and they gave him gum. They found a good one, and she doesn't even look Dutch to me, but anyway, then they put an article up in their own network. And so he made no effort to control his message, and he got the message defined for him. Here's another example from people you may recognize, these poor victims. This is a study that, according to a British newspaper, showed that we shouldn't allow fathers in the delivery room when their partners are delivering babies, because it could increase the pain. And so they started, people get really active in the comments at this newspaper about, yeah, I knew that all along, or he was a deadbeat, and it goes off in all directions. Well, the actual study didn't involve pregnant women, and it was a pretty respectable scientist from the Institute of Psychiatry. And all they did is stick people with a pin and give them a pencil and paper measure about the quality of their attachment. And they suggested if there is a conflicted attachment, if there's attachment difficulties, then people feel more pain in the presence of people than without them. But there were no pregnant people, and there was just a stick and a fancy methodology. And they were excited about laser evoked potential, a methodological breakthrough. They didn't care about pregnant women. They didn't feel one way or the other, and certainly it wasn't relevant to them. But they quickly had to try to get in. We didn't even study pain during childbirth. Where'd this come from? Okay. I met this guy in San Francisco, and he said he went up to Mount Tamalpais outside of San Francisco, and he met God. And she was non-authoritarian, non-judgmental, and non-interventionist, and so she only had suggestions for him. I decided his picture was good. So here is my 10 suggestions for the Institute. I actually think I got 9. Maybe we come up with another one. I think that recognizing the capital that you have in being such an institute, rather novel if not unique, then cultivate a skepticism based on your recognition of the prior probability of a claimed breakthrough in internet studies turning out to be exaggerated. Secondly, engage and familiar yourself with cognate disciplines. Often some of the worst studies are invaders from other areas who want to make a point they couldn't even possibly make in their own journals and their own discipline. Ensure that net studies embrace reforms that are happening elsewhere. Suggest that when possible, people pre-publish protocols, including their analytic plans, and designating the variables that they are studying. Emphasize transparency and reproducibility of novelty. Recognize that science doesn't produce a lot of novel breakthroughs every day, except for when it's the processes by which it appears in people's laps in the literature, the distortion. And provide data for reanalysis. Educate others. Take opportunities provided by hype and bad science as teachable moments. Like as they stumbled onto their feet and tried to respond to criticism about their study of childbirth, the Investigation Institute of Psychiatry started explaining what they really had done, perhaps too late to have an impact, because it's a lot less interesting story what they actually did than what showed up in the press. Become a go-to authority and a filter. That people are bombarded by stuff they can't read. Increasingly, scientists depend on Twitter and blog to find out about what's going on in the literature, and that's why the correlation between the impact factor of a journal and the likelihood your paper is going to be published is falling so rapidly. It's because people aren't going to the journals anymore. They're getting stuff off the internet. Google Scholar being a good case. Encourage journalists and scientists, educate them how to interpret studies, and assume an active and watchdog role. Formalize independent evaluation of claims and studies with a blog or a website. Facilitate post-publication review. I know there's not much to be said good about the credibility of the NHS, but they operate a wonderful website called Behind the Headlines, and they have an independent consulting firm that picks up on extravagant claims in the literature. And I'm often pleased when I've blogged about something and find that reached the threshold what they're doing, and we've overlapped a number of times. There was a study that somebody in Bristol claimed that they had a 12-pound test that would be given out to pregnant women to decide the risk for depression. It was absolute rubbish, and I don't know where he got the 12 pounds, but it was aimed at marketing people. And you see that they looked at the study and found that actually the claims that marriage protects you from health problems, the data are weaker than they look, and it could be similarly healthy people of similar social economic backgrounds marrying. And then there's this weird study recently brain-eating cannibals provide the key to treating diseases like
Creutzfeldt-Jakob.
yeah, that would be that'd be good.
Creutzfeldt-Jakob, it's a prion disease.
Oh yeah, prion diseases. Yeah.
Creutzfeldt-Jakob.
And they said no. It looked like that there was a certain selection factor. If you grow up in a society where you're eating people, then you die if you're susceptible to that. And so it probably wasn't much hope for. And who cares? We're not going to stop eating people anyway to an infrequent disease.
Speak for yourself.
Yeah. And then PubMed Commons. How many people know what PubMed Commons is? Oh, this is a new tool. How many people know how Medline became PubMed? So it used to be, if you wanted to look at the literature, the journals own your abstract once they publish your paper, traditional journals. And they wouldn't allow people to index abstracts because they owned it. It was a copyright violation. It decreased the value of their product. So they used to require you to go through a university portal where the university had to pay a lot of money for Medline. And until I was a number of conspirators, including I think one of them was Hilda Bastian, you may know from the internet, and they decided we're going to take that back. And so the journals got wind of this. They flew in all their lawyers, and so they found out that Al Gore, his wife, had just been diagnosed with cancer. And they approached him and said, you probably want to learn more about cancer, but you know that if you don't have a friend at a university, you can't search the literature because it's paywalled. And he said, that's outrageous. They said, well, could you go on TV and do the first PubMed literature search? And so that broke down, and the opposition from the journals dissolved, the publishers. So the next round was a couple of years ago, and I became beta tester. I came in late on the conspiracy. But basically the idea was that letters to the editor are a very weak form of peer publication, of post-publication peer review. There's real restrictions on the timeliness and the length of them, and the journals have high thresholds for accepting them, and very often they peer review your letter with prejudice, but they allow authors to respond to you without getting peer review. So they can insult you and they have the last word. So the idea is we would open it up, and anybody who's ever published a paper in PubMed, and there are 25 million papers there, has the right to comment on any of the other papers are there and start a thread. And that's the idea of getting all of the scientific literature published and get the commentary going there, rather than a couple people restricting and saying, no, this is of insufficient interest to our readership. But the new PubMed journal clubs, Commons journal clubs, we're now encouraging institutions to have one person who's ever published a paper in PubMed to organize journal clubs where they can contribute to the post-publication commentary. They're numbered, and we hope to make them citable CV items in the near future. And I think it'd be important as an institute to start some of these journal clubs. We know from randomized trials that reading a journal in a group for a year and doesn't change critical appraisal skills. People get good at saying snarky things or not saying snarky things, but they don't really improve their critical skills. Writing letters to the editor does improve those skills, but no one pays attention to them. I think PubMed Commons can routinize that everybody is commenting on everything. And I really encourage the Institute to take the lead. So, again, the message is there's a lot of bad stuff out there. There's no reason to think that internet studies are immune to this. There are good reasons to think it may be more vulnerable to this for the factors that I suggested. And it certainly, that was not a random sample of papers, but at least establishes the black swan thing. There's at least some stuff that isn't accurate and robust in the internet studies literature, and there may be more. We don't know how much more because the processes that distorts the accuracy of the scientific literature also keeps us from appraising to the extent to which it's actually happening. I'll stop there. You can follow me on Twitter or see my more devastating takedowns of editors, authors, and media, social media and conventional media have close mind the brain. Thank you.